Hey everyone, the start of the D4 season is almost upon us, and this is going to be another build guide on Sorcerer for the start of the game release. Now, this is going to be one of the two builds that, in my opinion, is going to most likely be the meta for Sorcerer, at least for leveling and maybe partially into endgame until we can figure out some other interesting builds. But I feel like just from looking at all of the Paragon and all of the endgame items, this most likely will be the super endgame pushing build for SORC. Now, I do have another video on a build guide on Charge Bolt, and in my opinion, I feel like out of everything available for SORC, that most likely will be the clear build, the one that you will use to go through either open world content or through dungeons or through whatever else you're farming at a very fast rate. And I feel like the build I'll be showing you guys today with Firewall will, at least some version of it, will be the endgame build where speed is not really the concern, but damage and survivability is important. So I feel like this will be the pushing build for Nightmare Dungeons. At least that is what seems to me the most likely case out of everything we see currently with the Act 1 testing and with all the data mining that's been done so far. So why don't we get into it and talk about it a little bit. This build is going to be mostly based around Firewall. Now, Firewall was buffed, and the damage of it is now absolutely insane. And based on all of the endgame items that we have available to us, is going to scale the best. So what Firewall does is it just puts a line of fire in front of you that is going to deal a very large amount of damage over a few seconds. The nice thing about this is we can overlap it as well. So we can apply multiple stacks of Firewall at the same exact time. To accompany this, we are going to be using the basic Sorcerer's package that I feel like you are going to be including in absolutely every single build of Teleport, Flame Shield, and Ice Armor. These buttons are just way too good to not include, and they give you way too much utility and mobility to ignore in your builds. Otherwise, we'll be including an Infernal as well, simply because there really isn't anything else that's very good for this build. And Infernal is just going to give us some really good grouping on a relatively low cooldown to be able to have more monsters be in our Firewall. Infernal is going to make a giant AoE. It does burning damage over a few seconds, and we're going to be picking up one passive point for it that makes it pull enemies in, so we can press Inferno on a big pack, then drop a few flame walls on top of it, and then that will allow us to clear everything pretty quickly. Lastly, we'll be using Firebolt as a filler. This will give us a little bit of mana, but we really shouldn't be struggling with mana in this build. And if we are, there are better ways to deal with it, but this will simply just be a filler and a way to activate some of our legendaries later on. If we want to very quickly look at the legendaries, now these are all going to be legendaries that you'll be obtaining simply by playing the game normally, and you will just be able to get these with no issues. There are going to be two, which are going to be mostly defensive based legendaries that you can't get by normally playing, but they're mostly just nice to haves if you do end up getting them, which is going to be protection aspect, and it's going to be a coincided aspect. Now, coincided might give us a little bit more damage, but I feel like this might be a little bit too rare to rely on. So it's just a nice to know about if you do end up finding it, which is going to give us increased damage while we have a berry active. In this build, we'll have a berry active a fairly decent amount of the time. The rest of these legendaries are simply just going to either be utility, such as basic skills give us 20% DR, or it's going to give us a little bit more movement speed, such as Flamewalker's aspect. When we come in contact with Firewall, we gain 25% movement speed for 4 seconds. Nice thing is we can get this in Act 1, which means we can have a pretty decently fast build from the get-go by just simply walking through our firewalls as we teleport around. One very interesting legendary that we're going to be including in this is going to be Edgemaster's aspect. Now, this might be a little bit experimental, but I feel like we will have the tools to deal with the requirements on it pretty easily, which should give us a big power boost. Skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when you cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have pool of primary resource. So if we put this on a weapon, this will instead be up to 40% increased damage. And if we can consistently keep ourselves at maximum mana, that means our flame walls just simply do 40% more damage, which shouldn't be too difficult to do between Firebolt and between a mastery that we can pick up for Ice Armor, which gives us 25% mana regen while it's active. As for the enchantments for this build, the nice thing is we are pretty flexible on what we want to get. Because there isn't anything that is really too insane, we can choose to pick up some defensive and utility-based enchantments instead of nothing but pure damage. The only one that we really might want to consider is the Firewall enchantment, which makes it so whenever an enemy takes burning damage, there's a 5% chance to spawn 2 firewalls underneath them for 3 seconds. Now, because it's such a low chance, and because it's only 3 seconds, this isn't really that big of a DPS boost. But if you did want a DPS boost, this would be your best option. If we don't really care about the minor DPS boost, or if I don't really need it for the content I'm doing, I would instead honestly opt to potentially pick up the Flame Shield enchant, which would give me a cheat death every 2 minutes, which should be pretty nice, as having a cheat death in a ARPG is always pretty strong. The other option would be to pick up the Fireball enchant, which makes it so whenever we kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball 50% of its damage. This would give you a little bit better clear, and it would make it so you don't necessarily need to hit every monster in a pack with Firewall. This will allow you to kill 1 or 2 of them, and then they should be able to explode the rest of the pack and give you some decent clear. Other good options might include picking up the Teleport enchant, which makes your evade instead become a teleport, which makes it substantially better and substantially stronger. Or you can choose to pick up the Ice Armor enchantment, which gives you a 5% chance every time you get hit to do a free Ice Armor. Outside of that, there really isn't anything else that's very good. There's the Incinerate enchant, which gives you a Serpent that gives you another burning effect. Although the targeting on this has seemed to be very bad. The Serpent doesn't really hit that big of an area. This node overall just really isn't good enough to consider using, unfortunately. You could consider using the Frostbolt enchant, which makes it so direct damage from skills applies a chill. That would mean your Firebolt also now chills things, which would give you more defenses. And it is not a bad option to consider. Otherwise, there really isn't anything else left in here. But between those enchantments, I feel like we can have some decent options. And I feel like Fireball probably is going to be the winner over everything else for the clear. And then after that, you can just either pick the Firewall one or the Cheat Death as the strongest secondary options. Let's talk about the tree for this build, and then we will talk about how you would go about leveling this. So the first thing that we're going to start with is Firebolt. This is going to be our main filler whenever we don't have anything else to do. And this is going to give us a way to get mana through Flickering Firebolt, and we'll get a little bit of AoE out of it through the pierces through burning enemies. Now, if we put down a Firewall first, then this will always be active, so we'll have a pretty easy way of getting a lot of mana. For our utility skills, we're going to be putting 5 points into teleports. This is because the cooldown of it is massively reduced every time we put a point to it, and it's just simply way too good to not put points into, as well as picking up the first point, which gives us less CDR if we teleport on top of a pack, and then we get 30% damage reduction for 5 seconds every time we teleport. With this and a little bit of CDR, we can permanently keep it up as we get teleport down to a 5-second cooldown. We'll also be accompanying this by Flame Shield, which is just a immunity for 2 seconds, and with the points after it giving us 25% movement speed and a 50% of our missing health shield. Now, we're not going to be putting any points to Flame Shield because this increases the duration of Flame Shield by a very, very minor amount, at which point it really isn't worth points until we're much later into our build and we are getting close to level 100 where we have a bunch of free points to actually spend. For Ice Armor, we are simply going to be adding this as a filler button, which gives us a 6-second 30% shield. We can put more points into this as well if you do want to be a little more tanky, as this does increase the shield up to 42% shield. And as they mentioned, if we do have mana problems, we can always pick up the first point for 25% mana regeneration. Moving on to the next section, we will be putting 1 point into Align the Elements. This was nerfed, so it's not really worth putting points into anymore, other than as a way to be able to get to Protection, which gives us a 30% of our health barrier for 2 seconds whenever we use a cooldown. And a cooldown this build is going to be Flame Shield, Teleport, and Ice Armor, which we'll be spamming as soon as we get them. There's also going to be Inferno, which will allow us to get a free shield, so we can just stay at there, Inferno, and then spam a bunch of Firewalls. Moving on to the next section of it is going to be Firewall, the main damage. We want to put 5 points into this to increase the damage over time as much as we can. Then we're going to be picking up the 25% increased burning damage while you are standing in Firewall, which means when we are fighting bosses, we will always want to be standing near them and within the Firewall, or you might want to drop a Firewall on yourself to benefit from the increase. Then for the last point, we're going to be picking up the enemies continue burning for 3 seconds after leaving Firewall. This will make your clear really nice, and this will make it so you don't have to deal with any annoying cases of your Firewalls not being positioned correctly. As long as an enemy runs through it for even a second, 3 seconds of the duration should be more than enough to immediately kill it. You can always get the mana regeneration per active Firewall as well if you have good Firewall positioning and if you have yourself a pair of Edgemasters. At that point, if you are struggling with keeping yourself close to full mana, Wizard's Firewall will fix that for you when you combine it with the mana regeneration of Ice Armor and the mana from Firebolt. We're also going to be picking up 3 points of Inner Flames. Because we have so many barriers in this build, we should be able to keep ourselves at a relatively high health amount quite often. And because later on we'll be picking up Warmth, which gives us quite a lot of regen while just fighting things, we can use Inner Flames to quite a big advantage, which gives us 9% increased damage while we are healthy. I do not remember the exact number needed for healthy, but it is basically meaning you want to be close to full life, and we should be able able to be at full life quite often in this build. For the last section, we're going to pick up Inferno, as I mentioned, simply as a way to pull things together for Firewall itself. And we're going to be picking up 1 point in Fiery Surge. Killing a burning enemy increases your mana regen by 10% for 3 seconds. You can put more points into this as well if you need more help with Edgemasters later on, but we're trying to pick up Endless Pyre. You deal increased burning damage to enemies for each second they remain burning, up to 15%. This is just 15% more damage against bosses. And if we are picking up the burning lasts for 3 seconds after leaving Firewall, that means that as you're running around as enemies are chasing you down, the damage from Endless Pyre will stack up, which will give you a easier way of killing them off and finishing them off. Lastly, a very, very important defensive layer for this build, in my opinion, is going to be Warmth. Every 1 second, you heal for 1% of your maximum life for each nearby burning enemy. Healing increased to 1.8 from bosses. So this just gives us around 2% health regen permanently while fighting bosses. Diablo is very much a game about consistently dodging, and we are going to be trying to put quite a lot of effort into not getting hit. The nice thing is, with how many different barriers we have in this build, if we do get hit, we should be able to spam a bunch of cooldowns, spam Ice Armor, and get ourselves some barrier, while the 50% of missing health from Flame Shield heals us up, and the rest is just done by Warmth. This should give you a pretty easy way of surviving most encounters. The last thing to talk about is going to be the mastery at the bottom. We're going to be picking up Combustion. Your burning effects deal 2% increased damage per unique source of burning you have applied on the enemy. If the enemy is burning from 3 or more sources, this bonus is doubled. So we are going to be getting effectively 6% more damage from Combustion. This is because Firebolt will leave a burning effect, and because Firewall will also do a burning effect, which means we'll basically always have 2 burns going on an enemy at the same time. The way we are going to be hitting 3 is going to be 3 Inferno, as this gives us a separate burning effect. So this makes Inferno into a damage amp as well, as it will turn it from 4% to 6%, but since there's 3 effects, that means we'll be going up to 12%, which gives Inferno effectively a 8% damage increase every 45 seconds. Now, another option on what you can do later on in this build is the ability to just pick up Hydra and go all the way down to the burn effect from Hydra. Now, this would give you 3 consistent burns, and that would mean Combustion is always at the maximum effect. And that would mean that when you press Inferno, that means you have a 4th burn, which would be doubled for 4% increased burning damage. This is up to you, and this is not going to be something you're going to have to do until you get to pretty late game content as another damage amp, but this should be something to keep in mind as something you might need as a endgame upgrade for this build and as a way to spend the last few points that you will have. Let's look at how you would level this and how you would get yourself to the place where you can finally swap over to Firewall, as we do need to get quite deep into our passive tree to actually get Firewall. So the first thing I would mention, since we do need 16 points to spend the rest of our tree, is to try and do everything you can for extra passive points. The first level of Renown in each zone gives you a passive point, and it's very easy to get. And you should be able to get this by the end of Act 1, but just in case you can't and you're in Act 2, try to do everything you can to get that first Renown point in the second act to get your passive points if you don't have enough already. But to start this build, we'll be starting with Firebolt. We'll just be immediately putting 2 points into Firebolt. We can pick up the Pierce if you want, and this probably is a good idea to do. But what we're going to be immediately going into is Fireball. So Fireball is a really good skill. They buffed it quite heavily, and we're just going to immediately put 5 points into it. You can pick up the small points if you feel like you're going to be playing from far away, as it does make the explosion a little bit bigger and should give you a little bit more clear. But the 2 points at the end aren't important. This one is crit damage, and this one is a node that takes your burning damage and immediately deals it as instantaneous damage. You could potentially pick this up if you really want to, but in my opinion, I don't feel like you will need it. And we just want to put 5 points into Fireball, and we'll just be pairing Fireball as we go. We can also go and pick up the mana, as we will not be able to sustain Fireball on its own. And I would say to immediately pick up Teleport, since having Teleport is just a no-brainer, and to pick up Ice Armor and the mana regeneration from Ice Armor. Between this and the mana gain from Firebolt, you should be able to Fireball quite often, and this should make it for a very comfy experience while you are leveling all the way to Firewall. To be able to get to Firewall, we're just simply going to be picking up Flame Shield. So we're going to be picking up the movement speed from Flame Shield, and we're going to pick up the heal. Now you can choose to skip on the heal if you don't want the heal, and instead get the cooldown reduction on teleports. But as soon as we have Firewall, we are going to start spending some points in it, but we're not going to be swapping over to Firewall until we have at least 5 points into it. So from here, we'll put 5 points in, and we can just use Firewall as you are leveling. You can just press 1 down on a boss and spam some fireballs, but eventually we do want to get rid of all the points in Fireball and just go pure Flame Wall. As soon as we have 5 points and we pick up the first node, we are ready to swap over. So at this point, we will be dropping everything related to Fireball. We would be putting 5 points into Firebolt since we'll have to. And then we will be picking up points into Teleports, and we will be making our way further down the tree. We also want to get the burning last for 3 seconds to have an easier time leveling, and to get ourselves to the next point of where we can pick up Infernal and Fiery Surge. We can pick up Inner Flames, as we should be fairly tanky and we shouldn't have too much of an issue keeping this up. And it very nicely gets us to exactly enough points to pick up Infernal. Here, we're going to immediately pick up Infernal just because it does so much damage. And you can immediately choose to pick up the pull if you would like the pull. To get ourselves to Combustion, we are now going to put at least 1 point into Fiery Surge. Depends if you need more or not, but 1 point should be more than enough. Then 3 points into Endless Pyre to get more damage, and then 3 points into Warmth to feel super tanky. The last point is going to go into Glass Cannon to give us more damage, or you can pick up the damage reduction from Teleports, and then we can finally pick up Combustion. From this point, we simply would just backfill the rest of the points to get our tree to look like this. And this should be able to get you to about level 50. Now, if you want to continue this build, I would simply either choose to get Hydras or fill in some more passive points that give you some passive effects. You can also potentially look into scaling lucky hits, or you can potentially look into scaling crit chance, as crit chance is going to be the way we scale this build into the late game. If we want to look at the end game for this build and we want to look at Paragon, and the reason we want to start stacking crit chance in our gear and in our skill tree is going to be the burning damage Paragon board that we can get for this build. The main attraction here is going to be the legendary node. Your burning damage is increased by 40% of your critical strike damage, further increased by 5% for every 20 intelligence you have. This is going to be ridiculously strong, as this allows us to benefit from crit, and there will be a lot of sources of crit damage in this game, which means we have a way to scale further. If we look at the rest of the legendary boards, unfortunately they're not very good, and there really isn't a way for other builds to realistically scale to very large amounts. Crits has always been a powerful thing to scale in basically any build in almost any game, and the fact that we don't need any crit chance and we just want to stack as much crit damage as possible, which typically comes in very large amounts, makes it so we can get quite a lot of increased burning damage really easily. If you look at the rest of the nodes in here, we can see that we have some really powerful effects, and we're probably going to be going for all of them because these are going to make us stupidly tanky. We have 4% damage reduction from enemies that are burning. Now, if we look at the other Paragon boards, typically most of these damage reductions are a lot more conditional. So for example, the cold ones are damage reduction from enemies that are chilled. Well, you can't chill a boss. The only time you can chill a boss is when it is staggered, and during that time it counts as being affected by every status effect in the game. But the boss will be AFK for a few seconds while they're staggered, so it doesn't really do anything for you. But this will just give you straight up damage reduction while the enemy is burning. And because our burns will persist on the enemy through the Firewall node, that means we can basically always keep this up. And there are quite a few of these, meaning we can get quite a lot of damage reduction, as well as the damage to burning enemies, which is super generic and super powerful since we don't need to realistically do anything other than just DPS as we normally are. Between these two nodes, we can get 8% damage reduction. And if we fill in the 250 dexterity requirements, we can get another 4%, meaning between this node and this node, we just immediately have 18% damage reduction. And then between this node and this node, we just get 40% increased burning damage. If we were to then stockpile this on top of getting some crit damage, this build can do some ridiculous numbers, and I feel like it will have some pretty strong late game scaling in terms of your total power. That's all I really have for this video. If you have any questions about this, feel free to leave a comment below, or feel free to come by Twitch and ask me yourself there. Between this build and the other build guide I'll be releasing on Charge Bolt, I'm not really sure which one I'll be playing. I feel like I want to start the Charge Bolt one because I feel like that one will be a little bit faster for clearing, and I feel like that'll be important for the story. But if I'm starting to struggle with damage, and if that build is not keeping up in terms of damage, I think I will swap over to this, as Firewall is just a very big number. And nice thing is it's just damage over time that persists, which means for bosses I can simply just put a Firewall on top of enemies and then just ignore the enemy and just run around for 8 seconds, and then I just have to put another one down after a few seconds, and I'm doing full DPS while being able to focus on the mechanics and focus on not dying. Otherwise, that's all I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed this build if you do end up playing it. I hope you have a lot of fun with it. It seems like a very simple build that doesn't really take too much effort. I will leave a link to this below in the description if you want to look at everything I have planned. And as always, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.